Yes. Today we're going to talk about documentation in software development processes. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about traditional documentation and then move on to documentation in agile processes. Okay? So, the topics of today: documentation and why do we document, documentation formats, documentation tools, documentation in agile processes, and the documentation audience in agile. Why documentation? If I go back here and ask you the question instead of you reading on the screen, why do we document things or software processes?
To have some proof of what happened, what we changed, and yeah, just the proof, just to document what we have done, what was changed, who did it, etc. Just to get the history of what happened.
Yeah, so that's process documentation.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but that's correct. That's part of the documentation. So other things. Why?
In case of someone wants to go in the project and redo it, he should be able to redo it only with the documentation.
Yeah. So we're maintaining the knowledge about the project. Yes. Because we have stakeholders, and these require it. One stakeholder in a process can, for example, be the product owner that needs the Jira logs to see that what you've worked on, and the hours you have spent on it. Another thing is another developer that jumps onto the project, maybe in the middle of the process. He is also a stakeholder regarding the code that is delivered in their project. It could also be to define a system contract model and to support the communication with external groups. So it's more or less documents or your type of communication that you communicate with external groups, stakeholders, etc., etc. It's all about communication, actually. You also need documentation to support organizational memory. What do you think I mean about that? Or do you have cases where you see the need for supporting the organizational memory? Let's say you have a large organization. You have like 20, 30 developers working on maybe 2 or 3 separate projects. Let's say that 5, maybe 6, 7 of those developers during a year quits. Maybe 2 of those developers were senior developers that had large implications in the projects as well. So what happens then? You lose a lot of knowledge regarding the projects that you are doing. And there's no way to get that back. So that means that when you document something, you are trying to support the organizational memory. You see what I mean? Yeah. Also for audit purposes, let's say that you have done a project for maybe a public organization of some kind. Maybe maybe a municipality or something like that. Then there may be certain cases where this is audited, the things that you're doing. We have had large projects now in the near time where we faced an organization that was very rigid, very bureaucratic, where all the documentation had to be correct and on place, so that they could audit the things that we have done. and to think something through, to actually discuss something with yourself. Let's say you're documenting an API. Okay, is this the right thing? Is this the right design for the interface that I'm looking for here? Is it generalized enough? Is it doing what it should do? So there are many reasons for documenting your projects. We can go on to documentation requirements. Why do we require documentation? It's a communication medium between team members. So let's say that you have a designer and a developer, for example. Whenever you get something from a designer, it could be useful to have a support document where maybe the user or the interaction elements in a design, in a UI, is described. Maybe you only get Photoshop documents with a design. Then you need to know what happens whenever you're clicking on something. Is there animations involved here, etc., etc. Also, communication from team members to like the Scrum Master or to the project owner or to the project manager. It's an information repository for maintenance. It could be information for management of planning purposes. It could be information for users, like user manuals and such. And it could be formal evidence related to system regulations and or certification. So there may be some kind of processes whenever you want to certify a system, depending on a certification system, then you need to provide some kind of documentation that is required in such a process. Okay, we move on to documentation types. First of all, we mentioned here process documentation, like to record processes and maintain. We'll come back to that. And the other type is product documentation. Describes the product being developed. So process document categories, it could be plans, estimates, schedules, reports, maybe a standards implementation documentation, and so on. Other process document categories, working papers that you work on, reports that you do during the process, emails, messages, wikis. For example, your Slack log is actually documentation of the process. If you have a Slack channel for one project, that's quite a good documentation on the communication between team members, for example. Your emails with your product owner, maybe you need those whenever you deliver a project, because you're not, you do not agree on this project or this delivery being as part of the requirements that you were agreeing on in the first time. Then it's good to have the emails, the communication that you have had with your clients. Wikis like Confluence, for example, can be used for documenting like meetings, documenting instructions like installing instructions, building instructions, etc. Internal process documents. A structured and well-organized process may drastically reduce the amount of process documentation produced in a project. So whenever you have a structured and well-organized process, this could be as much good for the project as well documented things beforehand. And we can also face external process documents that we need to ensure that is part of the project. Amount of the project documentation depends on, for example, the contractual agreements. Does the contract say that you need to deliver these and these documents? Okay, then you do that, of course. There can also be other contractual agreements that enforces a lot of documentation. Let's say that you identify high risks in a project. Then it could be useful to document the entire process, whatever you have done, and so on and so on. If you come in the situation that you can't fulfill the contract within the budget that is set for the contract. You also have regulatory requirements, formal regulations related to the project. That is typical for contracts that you do with public organizations and so on. Okay, moving on to product documentation. Now we're talking about system documentation and, for example, user documentation. System documentation. System documentation includes all of the documents describing the system itself. Do you know any type of system documentation types? You do. I know you do. Java, for example. The code documentation, that's one system documentation. Other things? Have you ever planned to build a database later anytime?
System models.
Yeah, system models, exactly. Database models. Other types of models then?
Use case, sequence diagrams.
Sequence diagrams. Class diagrams. Okay, system documentation documents. Requirements documents and rationale could be one type. Maybe the architectural model and a description of the architectural model. If you have huge, large systems that needs to be described at a higher granularity. Your component model, source code annotations, metadata, reasonable written code may also describe itself actually. If you are good at organizing your code, separating concerns and so on, the classes themselves and the different modules that you build can actually describe themselves. Good function names, good method names, good class names, etc. That's also a kind of documentation actually. System maintenance guide, if there are different routines you have to go through to set up and deploy a system, or routines you have to go through to update and patch the system, and so on. And you have user documentation, and these are typically based on the role that you are targeting. For example, managers needs functional system description, or system admin need an installation document. Novice user maybe needs an introductory manual, and experienced users only needs a reference manual, for example. Modeling is a huge part of system documentation. For example, system architecture modeling. system process models, sequence diagrams, and so on. Or component modeling, class diagrams, state diagrams, typically UML models, and so on. Data layer modeling, ER diagrams, and ER diagrams. And code annotation, code metadata with annotations in code documents. But these are the manual techniques that we use. We can also use automated techniques, like reverse engineering, based on schemas and documents, etc. Or documentation generation, based on the code annotations. Of course, there's some manual labor involved there as well. But you can generate documentation UIs with code annotations and metadata and the correct system. Reverse engineering, we have some examples. Code to UML component diagrams, for example, and the other way around, e.g. Visual Studio and Eclipse UML generators. I suppose maybe you also have other examples, maybe, from other IDEs? No? If you have a good component model in UML, you can generate the code directly from that. DB schema to ER diagram, I actually use that a lot because whenever you have not got a documented database, you can use, for example, MySQL Workbench to reverse engineer so that MySQL Workbench analyzes the database and sets up the relations and the diagram for it. So that's a good tip for you whenever you're going to to document the database. Have you tried that? No? And documentation generation. Generating documentation based on code annotations, Javadoc for Java, PHP documenter for PHP, Yarn for Ruby, and PyDoc for Python, for example. There are several different systems for generating documentation, code documentation. Documentation generation, it should say 2 because this is the second slide. Generating documentation based on specification languages. Have any of you now built any REST APIs in the project? Or any other? Have you tried building a REST APIs? Yeah? Because then Swagger is a good tip. Because whenever you configure or describe a REST API based on the Swagger standard, then you can document the REST API automatically with a Swagger generator. And OAI, Open API Initiative, standardization of REST specification, and this is also based on Swagger, so it's the same principle. Okay, let's move on to documentation in Agile. What does the Agile Manifest say about documentation in Agile? Do you remember that? If you remember that, it's a star.
Shouldn't have much.
Yeah, something like that. Working software over comprehensive documentation. So we want to prioritize working software over comprehensive documentation. But it's also always, you have to be pragmatic here. It's always a consideration based on what is required from the stakeholders, and do you have a large institution or development organization like Google, for example? They are more dependent on documenting the software that they develop, because there are several developers involved, more than the projects that we, for example, run, where we have mostly on one project like 4 developers. But in Agile, we want to prioritize working software over comprehensive documentation. So how much and when? It depends on 3 parameters. Actually more, but these are quite essential. First of all, essential, keep documentation concise, concrete and concise. Code annotation, for example, is concise. Valuable, documentation must be justified by value. If you have one developer and you know that this is the only developer in the entire life cycle of the project, do you need any documentation then? No, probably not. Maybe if it's if the project runs for 1 year or something like that, then maybe the developer actually forgets what he did in the first part of the project. But you have to consider this: is it valuable for the project? Timely. Documentation just in time. So consider in the end of a sprint, for example, do we need to document the product that we're delivering at the end of this sprint? Yes, we have 2 features here. They need to be documented. We need code annotations there. We need to generate a REST API documentation as well, because there are we are integrating with a system that other developers depend on, and those have to know the contract between these systems. So okay, then we do it. We do it, for example, with automatic generation of documentation of that REST API, and we do it just in time. JIT, just in time. Prefer executable specifications, e.g. executables tests. That is also part of the documentation. If you do TDD or BDD, behavior-driven development, tests provide the basics of the JIT documentation. If you go as far as doing BDD, I'll come a little bit back to what BDD is. BDD tests typically validate a specific functional requirement, functional acceptance testing. That means if you provide a user story, that should be able to be validated by a BDD test. Tests specify the requirements of the design and provide a reported validation of your work. What is BDD then? Have anybody heard the term BDD? In BDD, you define business requirements in natural language with, for example, Gherkin DSL. You have several different BDD frameworks: Cucumber for Ruby, Behat, and Mink for PHP. So I suppose you have something for Java as well. You have Cucumber.js for Node. The main thing here is we have worked with it. We have worked with user stories during this project now. So you're familiar with that. Okay? That's functional requirements. That's requirements that the product owner has, that we need to fulfill whenever we develop the software. So let's say we have this kind of user stories. It's a feature that's called search. In order to see a word definition as a website user, I need to be able to search for a word. Okay, so that's our user stories. How do you validate this? in Gherkin, we set up a scenario. Searching for a page that does exist, given I am on a specific page, when I fill in search with behavior-driven development, that means the element with ID search, and I press search button, the element with ID search button, then I should see agile software development. It's a part of the text on the page. So in this way, we're using a specification language, Gherkin, to define an actual test to validate the user stories that we have written for this project. And Gherkin interpreters like Mink and Behat can interpret this kind of lingo and do this test. And this means that both stakeholders, both your project members can understand the actual validation, and product owners that maybe are not technical persons can also understand the validation of the specification. So this is also a way to document and validate that you have developed something according to the specifications. Another concept that is quite important, document late, defer the creation of documents as late as possible. Systems, overuse, etc. are best written towards the end of a development cycle of a release. It doesn't say why. So why? Why is it best?
Well, because it should be finished product in some, so you actually know how it actually turned out.
Yeah, exactly. The requirements change. That's what we have talked about all the time in agile software development. So also what we do as developers change. We change our GB model more or less until we get something stable that we know that we're going to use. But we're changing our DB models. We're changing our code all the time. We're refactoring. It's part of the quality processes that you have in a project. So that's why system overviews are best written towards the end of a development cycle or a release, because then we have a state of our software. We have a final state. We should have a final state in the end of a sprint. So this is typical waterfall design-driven development phases, where we document a lot in the start, and we change a lot on the documentation. This is the traditional way of using it. Maybe detailed project plan, detailed requirement specification, etc., etc. Or in agile processes, we keep the documentation as low as we can, as long as we can, and document just in time. It's also important to think about simplification. Simplify. Be clear and concise in your documentation. As I said, code annotation, that's clear and concise. But if you, for example, write an installation document for a system admin or something like that, then it is entirely possible to write a 20-page installation document with a lot of different instructions and so on, when you actually need one page with the actual instructions of what you do in the CLI to install this project. Sorry. Modularize. Small documents interlinking. So use wikis, use document generators that generates based on code annotations and so on. Make the information accessible and, when possible, publicly available. what to document, work closely with your audience. Customers, users, etc. should provide valuable information on what is demanded in documentation. Typically, users are valuable in user manual writing, for example. If you need a user manual for your software, and that, of course, could happen, then you have to refer a little bit with your users what they actually know from beforehand. What are the target groups here? So that you know what to document. And when to document, iterative documentation throughout the development lifecycle. Strive to document little pieces as you go along and get feedback from fellow team members. Documentation is a requirement itself as well. It could be in certain projects. Treat documentation as a requirement that should be in a prioritized work stack. So you need issues for this in Jira, for example. Documentation is a work item and should be planned and assessed as any other work item. If it doesn't provide necessary value according to the workload, it should be down prioritized. So before a sprint starts, you can actually say that we have this documentation issue in our backlog. Should that go into this sprint or shouldn't it? Yes, we need that actually. We need that REST API documentation because another development team is integrating with our tool. So we need that ready for the next release. If not, you down prioritize it. Do it just in time. Document audience in Agile. Agile documentation and type of documents. Let's look at that. No. Sorry, that was a slide that should have been removed. So forget that. Yes, recurrences. Any questions to documentation in general and in Agile processes? No? It's quite clear. Yes. Okay. I said last time that the sprint we were doing after last time was the last sprint. We still have time until delivery of the project. So I will encourage the groups to prioritize here now, because you're going to write a report. You're going to write a group report and an individual report. So you need a lot of time for that. If you're not started then you have it covered maybe. But a lot of this sprint, I suppose, will go into that work. So you have to refer with your product owner and with your other group members how much work you can put into the time we have until the sprint report is to be delivered, which is 10th of December. Okay? So if there are things that you must do, that you think, oh, I need to resolve this issue just for just to sleep at night. If there are important things that you want to do in the project that you maybe thrive for doing, then of course you can do work on the project. But remember that you also have this project report and the individual report. And regarding the individual report and the group report, I will write you an email to the entire group with the expectations that I have for those reports. Okay? It's already documented a little bit on Confluence, but I typically get questions about this for the last bit. So I'll write an email to the entire group. If you still have questions after you have received that email, just ask me on the email. I'll answer as fast as possible.
What is the deadline for those 6 reports? What is the deadline?
10th of December.
Ah, okay. And we have normal spring right now anyway.
It-
After the right now,
What did you say?
I mean, do we have normal sprint right now? Again, next one? It's just normal sprint, or we need to finish our work? How is it going?
Yeah, it will be a normal sprint,
Okay.
but the actual work sprints were finished until this week. But as I said now, if there are issues that you want to resolve and you have time to resolve them, of course, use that for project work, actual development and such. But remember that you have the projects as well, the project reports as well to finish. Okay? I will set up a schedule for the oral exam as well. It is on 15th of December. Probably it depends on how many students we are at the moment, but somewhere between 8 and 4 o'clock in the evening you will get your scheduled time, but I'll set that schedule up as soon as possible on Confluence, and of course inform you about that as well. Okay? I think that was it. If I have anything to add, I add it to the email that I will send to everyone. Okay? Yes. Have a nice weekend then. Ja.
Vi går an å ta den muntlige eksamen over Skype, da. Lignende.
Hvis det ikke er i den tida som går, da. Off-campus-studenter som i utgangspunktet var off-campus, der har fått til det der.
Da får jeg ta på fra det andre, men da får jeg bare fullføre det her, da.
Ja. Ja, for vi kan ordne det, altså, hvis du ønsker det. For nå er det så nære at det liksom...
Ja, det var det ingen meg på.
Hæ?
Det er nesten ansiktet trekker seg nå. Jeg kan også gjøre det ferdig.
Ja, ikke sant.
For det er jo den her sprinten, så den perioden mellom 25. og 10. desember, da.
Ja. Men vi kan jo få til ordning på det, altså. At vi tar det overskudd.
Ja, bare litt kjærlig der.
Yes.
Forespørsel. Skriftlig forespørsel.